got him. Third floor.
Authorities say this man owes $17,000. This one, they say, owes 7 times that amount. And each could go to jail or at least lose his license if he fails to pay up his back child support. Deadbeat dads on the docket this week for due process.
Major funding for due process is made possible by the New Jersey State Bar Foundation, committed to educating the public about the law. Additional funding is provided by Lawyer's Diary and Manual, publishers of print and electronic information for and about the legal community, including the legislative manual.
They owe more than $1 billion in all, but New Jersey's deadbeat dads are finally on the firing line. The state won't just drop you a warning these days, and garnishing wages is just the beginning of new get-tough moves on the state's scofflaw parents. Aggressive new laws that can make your life miserable if you're among the thousands who won't pay their child support. And the sponsor of those laws will face off here today against a former public advocate who says the pre-dawn police raids on deadbeat dads are probably unfair and quite possibly illegal. But first, with her on-the-scene take on the raids, here's Sandra King.
Raymond, 3 times this year, county sheriffs across the state have set out pre-dawn to round up deadbeat dads, drag them to court, and make them pay. It's a policy being set in the State House. Governor Whitman even went out on one raid, and we went along on the latest of the roundups to check out the action where it's greatest, in Essex.
Hold on.
What's your name?
Jones.
What's the name?
Where's the bathroom? That's it. What's your date of birth?
We got a warrant out for your arrest. You're under arrest.
Montclair, Essex County. Barely 7 a.m., an arrest in progress, a man dragged from his bed and cuffed despite protest.
Disregards to?
Put your hands together like you're praying.
The officers had swept past his young son to get their man, not for any violent crime, but for what they claimed was his failure to pay his child's upkeep.
Right here?
All right, Sarge, come around. We got him. Third floor.
And with $1.1 billion owed in back child support throughout the state, hundreds of millions of it owed to public welfare, authorities say it is time to get tough.
You don't think it's too severe to get people out of their homes at dawn?
No, not at all. I think that once the court issues a warrant, it's like any other warrant. And you're right when you say that they're not violent criminals. Most of them are not. But the fact of the matter is that them and the nose at the system, and the system usually suffers one way or another.
These aren't guys who've just missed a couple of payments.
No, usually, first of all, the system doesn't work that quickly. Secondly, I would guess the average person who walks in this courtroom who owes money is in the area of $15,000.
And Edward Jones fits that profile, according at least to his probation report.
Total arrears as of today's date, $17,845.96. There has been no payment made on this account.
Since?
September 11th, 92.
But Jones told the judge he had reason not to pay.
My son has been living with myself and my family all his life. Why I'm being taxed and charged is totally...
And unlike most of the men rounded up and brought into court that day, Jones was allowed to walk out without payment.
I'm going to release you, sir.
Thank you.
You have 2 weeks to bring in the proof that the child's been living with you.
Almost everyone here has a story to tell.
I didn't know I owed child support because I thought when my wife got the house, that was everything that I owed.
How many children do you have?
2.
But the judge was not about to buy this one. Could be because of how much Bob Clark owed.
$112,000?
Yes.
Total amount of?
Total amount of arrears, $115,929.
First one I've ever seen over $100,000, but I do see them at $60,000 and $40,000 and a lot at $20,000. How much is probation looking for? He owes over $100,000.
Probation is looking for $10,000.
Sir, $10,000 to be released.
To be released?
Mm-hmm. And then you're going to have to continue to make your payments thereafter, as ordered by Judge Schwartz.
Yeah, I don't have $10,000.
All right, remand him $10,000.
Of course, some of the targets lucked out that day. When the officers came, they had gone.
He lives here, but he's not here now.
Does he have to work?
Yeah.
Where does he work, Cameron?
He didn't tell me, honestly.
But the ones they caught up with were coming downtown to tell it to the judge.
People of the county have been supporting your child to the tune of almost $12,000, and they're owed that money back.
Well, I don't know how I'm gonna get it if I'm in jail. You know, Judge, if I'm not working, I can get the money, you know?
But the judge told Wright he'd come up with some money,
$2,000, sir, to get yourself out of jail.
or he'd stay in jail.
Interestingly enough, the old "you can't get blood out of a stone," somehow or other, most of the stones bleed. And although we may not be able to get the exact amount, we do get a substantial payment towards the arrearage.
The message is, look, it's a no-nonsense approach. Get your butt in here and take care of your obligation.
You think it works?
I think it works. If I didn't think it worked, I wouldn't be participating in it.
And the sheriff defends those pre-dawn raids on deadbeat dads. But he also concedes there are frequent mistakes, warrants that should never have been issued. We saw 2 such mistakes in just the morning we went out. And that, Raymond, is just one more reason why this whole campaign is so controversial.
And the controversy remains beyond the raids. There are critics also of the new Get Tough laws that lift a man's license to drive a car or even to practice his licensed profession if he's in arrears for more than 6 months. And when we come back, we'll meet the state senator who authored those laws and the state's former public advocate who thinks the whole thing has gone too far. So stay with us.
I think they should be locked up, and like if they have like a program in jail where they make money, the money should be sent to their kids.
You can't lock them up because the child will be out support completely.
The law enforcement should tighten down to make sure that they do pay at some point.
They should be locked up. That's what they should be.
They should be put in jail or something.
Depends on what he can do to pay his child support.
Suspend licenses and anything that'll make them pay up for not supporting their child.
Dragging deadbeat dads out at dawn?
That's rather barbaric, and I'm sure that there's better ways to handle it than police raids.
But what other ways are there to dent the problem of dads or moms who simply refuse to support their kids? A problem that carries a billion-dollar price tag. Let's put that question to State Senator Wayne Bryant and former public advocate and Rutgers law professor Al Slocum. Senator Bryant, it's a serious problem, but are there other ways to accomplish this besides putting people in jail or suspending their licenses, affecting their ability to go to jobs, or in some cases even taking away their ability to have a livelihood?
Yeah, I think there are. I mean, we've also invested in that folks who settle lawsuits, folks who are entitled to settlement of lawsuits, like when there are accidents, that first we ought to be able to check, see in fact whether in fact they owe child support, and we ought to take those proceeds from them prior to them receiving the proceeds from any of those type of civil lawsuits. And we've done that, and we've taken about $1 million in the last 7 months.
Well, if you can get $1 million that way, why is it necessary then to, for example, as we saw in this report, arrest a man in front of his son? It has to be traumatic for the kid, and in at least one case that we saw, it turned out to be pretty unnecessary.
Well, some people believe that the public humiliation in itself sends a signal. I'm more practical about it, and I like the things...
How do you feel about the public humiliation?
I think it has some portion to play. I would not overplay it because I think the real goal is to can we get dollars to help support children. I believe in terms of if in fact you have licenses, that's a privilege in our state. That privilege ought to go with some responsibility, and that responsibility is to support your children.
Al Slocum, I've known you a long time, and I know you believe in parents supporting their kids. How do you feel about humiliation as a tool of accomplishing that?
Oh, well, it's clear to me it's inappropriate. It's inappropriate because as I understand the system under which we operate, punishment is meted out by the judiciary. It's not meted out by any other branch of government, and when it's done so, it's inappropriate. And my judgment is humiliation is punishment.
In these cases, do you think it is appropriate to what they are accused of having done, which is to not properly support their kids?
Well, you see, I'm troubled about that because I think the state's only interest in whether dads support their children or not is when the burden is placed inappropriately on the state. And to that extent, they want to recoup those losses because it's not their business to support other people's children necessarily. In my judgment, they have to have a cost accounting to demonstrate to me that this process is indeed cost efficient, which I doubt.
Well, does it come down to dollars? Would you support it if it were demonstrated that the state is going to bring in enough dollars to sufficiently offset the cost of doing it?
When you say would I support it, we'd have to do some...
Would you support the concept of arresting people at 5 o'clock in the morning when they're in arrears on child support? Under no circumstances.
No, under no circumstances would I. See, I think during the working day, that's when warrants ought to be routinely administered or executed.
So is it just the time? At noon, it would be okay to arrest them?
Oh, well, I believe this. If, in fact, the state legislature passes a law that says it's a criminal act to engage in certain conduct, which makes a warrant an appropriate means to carry out the mandate of the statute, then I think then you have to issue the warrant and you have to execute the warrant.
Being behind in your child support, are you comfortable with the concept that people should be
arrested?
arrested?
Well, I thought Charles Dickens put that issue to rest, quite frankly. I thought debtors' prisons were long since passed. But so you have to do something other than say there's a debt and an obligation.
It sounds like Al Slocum suggests that the system of which you are in part one of the fathers is a pretty old-fashioned barbaric system.
Well, where we disagree, he believes only when the state is in debt. I do not. I believe we set the public policy in terms of what are the responsibility of parents to their children. And irregardless of whether the state is doing it through welfare or some source, if the state can say and should have the obligation to say that if in fact you want to practice law, medicine, if you want to be an engineer, if you want to be a plumber, that in order to have that license in which you get state blessings for, that you ought to also have some obligations to your children. And then both parents brought these children into the world, and therefore it will not fall on one parent to actually raise and support that child, irregardless of whether the state is actually providing any other resources. I think we have an obligation to say to that person, you must, in fact, provide support for your child, especially if the court, understand, one thing we do agree, the court made the first order, that they actually owe it and what they should be doing. Now the person is disobeying that order, then we have an obligation to say that you must perform.
Well, let's look at the practical question here. For example, if a man's in jail for 2 or 3 weeks, which can happen, there's a cost to the state. And if he's in jail for $7,500, $10,000, doesn't that begin to raise the issue of whether it's even cost-effective to approach the problem that way?
Always the way you approach a problem is not whether it has a cost-benefit in terms of what does it send the message to what our tolerance level is as a society. We're saying we have zero tolerance to those folks who do not want to support their kids. Kids cannot be like a used car lot, that when you finish with the wife, or the relationship, that you can just walk away from them like they're a used car lot and leave them alone. They have an obligation to support them. These are individuals who have been to court, have been told that they have to support, and now they refuse to obey the law.
Are you comfortable, Al, with a man sitting in jail, either in due process or cost-effectiveness terms, under these circumstances?
No, I'm not comfortable with that at all, but I have to tell you, when I listen to the comment that was made that says, even if it's not cost-effective, it would still be appropriate to do this. I was troubled by that statement. It was troubling because that's much too much government for me, and I never thought I'd be saying that because, you know, too much government isn't an issue that's dear to my heart. But in this instance, I'm somewhat offended because I'm a family person, and I hate to think that the government now can decide the extent to which it thinks my conduct relevant to my children is appropriate.
Well, what about the license issue, not just driver's licenses, but for example, if a man is a licensed craft, plumber or some other craft, are you comfortable with the state?
No, I'm not comfortable with that at all because, you see, that's what I said. I don't think it's cost efficient. The program as a whole, I don't think it's cost efficient. I think we ought to have some cost accounting, and people ought to demonstrate that the taxpayers are actually being alleviated. But the truth is, I'm persuaded, you pay overtime to police officers, you've got the judiciary sitting overtime when case management is a big problem. It costs to incarcerate.
Well, if it's not cost effective, why are Senator Bryant and his colleagues doing this?
Oh, because I think it's a political plum, so to speak, that you heard the commentary on the tape, and you saw all those people say, I think it's terrible, the nomenclature that's employed, deadbeat dads. I mean, it's something that you can be popular with and say, oh, they're terrible people, and so politicians get some mileage out of that.
But
did you and your colleagues do this to get political mileage?
Let's separate whether, in fact, you pick up people at 6 o'clock in the morning to those dealing with licenses. That is cost effective. Does not cost us very little money in order to take people's licenses, in order to enforce the support laws. Let us talk about if you have a civil judgment to tell an attorney that you must go and find out before you distribute the money in 30 days. That's cost effective. We're not losing any money in terms of what it costs the state. Now, whether in fact, when I say cost effective, I'm talking about to the particular case, it might not be cost effective. I think overall it is cost effective because it sends a signal to the rest of the community where it becomes cost effective.
But if a man is in a position where losing his license costs him his job or makes it unable to earn, haven't we, in effect, forgotten about cost and put him in a position where the child may get less support and we haven't accomplished very much?
In all of these cases, the person is at least 6 months behind. The child's not getting support at all anyway from this individual. What it is about personal responsibility, how much you think personal responsibility a person should have. They ought to understand the consequences of their actions of not providing support for their child, keeping their child normally in poverty, or to cost you something. If that's your own job or your license, that is a decision you made, and you made that decision by not coming forth. We do have protections in there that, I mean, if in fact you come forth, you pay a certain amount, that you can continue with your license. So it's not a all-in-one, but at the same time, if you continue to refuse, then you've made an affirmative decision that you'd rather not support your child, and you don't mind losing your license to work.
Al Slocum, given your unhappiness with this level of government intervention, what solutions would you pose to the problem of people who don't properly support their children?
Well, you see, I think we've got to redefine the problem. That's the first thing. It's not just you can say there is this problem of deadbeat dads. See, I'm not persuaded that for those people who are subjected to these roundups in the middle of the night, and I don't even believe it's at dawn, quite frankly. I wasn't aware of the fact that the sun rose at 2:30 in the morning. But that fact notwithstanding, it's pretty clear to me that we have people who can't care for their children. And we have to worry about jobs. It's clear to me we have to worry about employment. We have to worry about income levels. And to me, until you address those issues, you're going to have deadbeat dads and deadbeat moms as well. Until such time as the lower classes, the lower middle classes and the like have opportunities of employment that provide revenue streams to meet those responsibilities.
So would you argue that social restructuring has to take place before you can pursue people who have not paid their child support?
Well, there's pursuit and then there's pursuit.
Senator Bryant?
Professor Slocum is really arguing that the courts then are making a mistake in ordering the child support. The legislature in any of these bills basically says the foundation is upon the judiciary to establish whether a person even ought to owe child support. So we're not taking that judgment away from the courts. So what he's arguing is the courts are wrong in terms of giving child support in the first place. All we're doing is having remedies once the court has made that analysis and you fail to follow through.
Let's look at two other issues which creep in here. One is a question of gender and the other perhaps a question of economics and class. We've talked about deadbeat dads. That's certainly the way this is captioned in the headlines.
Deadbeat parents.
But in fact, the numbers of women
99%.
are relatively small, true?
That's right. 99% of males.
Do you think that's going to grow or change, or is it always going to be males?
I think as women become more in the workforce, and as you start to see a small shift, is relatively going to stay the same. Men are normally not the custodial parent, but I think you will see in the future men be a little bit more, but I don't think it's going to get to be a 70-30. I think you're still going to see a 90-10 at the best.
Now, Al Slocum, part of your analysis was that we need to be concerned about jobs for people in order to take steps like this. Do you think that there are middle income and even wealthy folks who are also not paying their arrears, and how do you come out on that issue in terms of the use of this procedure?
Oh, I would guess that the marital difficulties are conducive to fights over how much money is going to be spent in child support, and I'm sure that that's an issue that takes place in the upper class as well as the lower classes. But when it comes to midnight raids, when it comes to the crack of dawn, so to speak, in terms of enforcement, I think there is a class of people that are more likely to be identified for those purposes.
So you think that this kind of procedure is more likely to be used with the poor? Or
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And I would take issue with the notion that this is court mandated, because if it was court mandated, I would take less issue with it. But what the court has said in a civil proceeding is that there's an obligation that exists. And what we've done with that civil proceeding is turned now individuals who are engaged in a civil action, now we're making criminals out of them and treating them in the worst of all possible ways.
Now, in the raid that Sandy King went on with our cameras, they went to North Caldwell. There was nobody home. Do you think that was done in order to suggest incorrectly that there's a demographic spread, or do you think they tend only to go to working class communities with these kind of raids?
Well, the publicity that I've seen is limited to those individuals who are less fortunate in our society.
Does this procedure disproportionately disadvantage folks who are at the bottom of the line?
But if it does, then we ought to make sure that we change it. I mean, I agree.
What is the legislature doing to monitor that, to determine it, and to make a judgment about whether it is disproportionately?
My understanding is that we're supposed to get a report back within 2 years from the date, and I think that was in 1995. So 97, we ought to be getting a report back of Hallis Workton, who we've captured within the net. But I want to separate still the midnight raids, because we act like that's the total law. The other parts are not criminal in nature. The other parts are just talking about that once the court has made a decision that you don't have a right to practice as a plumber if in fact you don't pay your child support. If you get a civil lawsuit claim, you should not be enriched by that claim and then at the same time ignore your children. Those are not criminal penalties. These are civil remedies and adding to the remedies once a court's made a determination. And I don't think the professor is disagreeing with that. I mean, because the court has already made a decision that you had to pay the support.
The issue is not whether I disagree, it's that I don't understand the rationale. Why would you take away a plumber's license because he has an obligation, a fiscal obligation that he has failed for whatever reason to meet?
Because the plumber's license derives from the state, its ability to give a person an opportunity to make a living. And all we're saying is that we also have an obligation to pay child support. We're not going to give you the privilege to use the privileges that the state authorizes if in fact you're not fulfilling your responsibility.
Why are you offended by the concept of taking a man's license away?
Because, see, I thought licensing was a function of competency. You want to make certain that people who hold themselves out capable of doing a particular task can indeed do it, and that we rely on that licensing system to address issues of competency. But now we're using licensing as a club, and that's punishment. And to me, the judiciary has the province with regard to punishment.
Now, Senator Bryan hasn't asked me to do this, but let me ask you to give him some advice. It seems to me that welfare is a hot-button political issue, and that there's a demand by much of the public that there be reimbursement for welfare dollars, including working folks and people at the bottom of the economic ladder. How does he address that demand, given the fact that these are the few resources that he thinks or that others think are useful in getting these dollars back?
Well, I think you ought to be candid when it comes to that particular kind of demand. When I served as the public advocate, there is a statute that requires those who benefited from our services when I served as the public defender as well. And you couldn't avail yourself of the services of the public defender unless you were deemed to be indigent. After we represented them, the state legislature passed a law that said, okay, now you owe us the money for the legal services that we were provided, and they gave me the responsibility to collect that money.
Now that you've heard from Al Slocum,
I didn't collect
I'm sorry. How do you deal with that balance? That is, on the one hand, there are people clamoring to have the system paid back, but clearly there are people who are not in a position to effectively reimburse the system.
Well, then I go back on the judiciary. They then ought not have imposed a responsibility. That is not something we in the legislature are doing. We're not making the initial judgment as to whether in fact you can or can afford to pay. It is the judicial system, which the professor has clearly said that should be. But when he talks about that punishment, even though I don't agree that this is punishment.
It's not punishment to sit in jail for 3 weeks because you don't have the $10,000
I'm talking about in terms of losing your license. It's not a punishment. That is something you've done with a voluntary act because you failed to follow something which the courts have demonstrated for you.
To be deprived of your livelihood is not a punishment.
It's not deprived of your livelihood. You got the livelihood through a license. And therefore,
but if at a certain point I can't go out and be a plumber and I can't bring money.
But this is public policy issues.
But is it a good policy? Because that's what we're here talking about.
Absolutely excellent policy. Excellent policy. If we don't care about the upbringing of our children, what else do we care about as a society? If, in fact, we can say that you can take your children as a used car lot and a used car, what are we saying as a society? I mean, what is more basic than supporting children in our society?
Quickly, Al Slocum, what's wrong with Senator Bryant's assessment that that's good policy?
Well, I don't understand the analogy between children and the used car lot, quite frankly, because, you see, I do think parents do have a responsibility to their children, and I'm a little concerned when you tell me public policy would dictate how families ought to interact with each other. I'm concerned.
How would you make them pay, Al?
Well, to be honest with you, my view is I would treat this as a debt and an obligation as I would treat any other debt and obligation. You can attach assets. I mean, when you execute on a judgment, we're familiar with how that works, and I don't believe that this is any different than any other kind of judgment.
Why is it different?
Oh, it is different because it deals with children. That is the whole point, and that is where it's wrong. It is different than any other kind of debt. This is about whether in fact our children should continue to slip in poverty. That is what is happening by one parent just moving away. When you say you don't understand about the used car lot, what it basically says is many of these cases, they start another family, and therefore the other family, they forget.
So in your view, this kind of a debt ought to be treated like any other obligation?
That's my view, and I think when you get into behavior modes, and you're talking about behavior modification, because this is what I'm hearing, then I think you're way off beat when you talk about behavior modification and what people ought to do with their children.
Do you think this is a dangerous process that could lead to other kinds of problems down the road?
When you start telling me they could create other families, and all of this arises out of the existence of a debt, it's disturbing to me.
Are you disturbed at all?
I'm not disturbed at all. I think any person who walks away from their children and walks away from an order of a court, once it's been determined, ought to have whatever we can do in public policy to make sure that they support.
Thank you for being with us, Senator Bryant. Al Slocum, former public advocate, Rutgers law professor, thanks to you, and thanks to all of you for watching. But we'll be back next week to talk about men and women who run away from more than child support. Nick Bissell was just the latest. Fugitives, how they flee, how they're tracked. Next time on Due Process. Till then, I'm Raymond Brown.
Stand up, sir.
Hands behind your back.
Put the palms together. Put the palms together.
People of the county have been supporting your child to the tune of almost $12,000, and they're owed that money back.
Well, I don't know how I'm gonna get it if I'm in jail. You know, Judge, if I'm out working, I can get the money, you know?
You weren't working when you weren't in jail, so...
Well, I'm talking about now, you know. If I'm working, I can get the money.
See how much you can raise.
Raise how and from who?
That's your problem.
Yeah, evidently.
Major funding for Due Process was made possible by the New Jersey State Bar Foundation, committed to educating the public about the law. Additional funding was provided by Lawyer's Diary and Manual, publishers of print and electronic information for and about the legal community, including the legislative manual.